For someone that comes in and is ruminating, which is such a common thing, how do you advise them to get out of that loop?
Let's just say you're really worried about something you said at a party and your mind keeps going around in circles about, I shouldn't have said that, what's wrong with me, they're going to think I'm blah, blah, blah. And then it might be, okay, just slow down for a second. And what would it be like to put in this phrase, I'm noticing I'm worried about what other people think of me. So it's separating myself from the thought. I am not my thought, and thoughts are not facts.
Emily, you're actually a clinical psychologist. Talk to us about why people may catastrophize over situations that will never occur.
We do have a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of the bad thing happening in combination with an underestimation of our ability to cope with what happens. The mind is pulling you off into the future. And when it's pulled you off into the future, you're missing out here on what is here. And provided there is nothing attacking us right now, in this moment, we are safe. In this moment, we find the safety. What I know to be so true is that the more present I am, the more rich my life feels.
They say that comparison is the thief of joy. I've experienced it in my own life. I think we all have. How do we get out of the cycle of comparison? In 2021, you were diagnosed with breast cancer, which, it's just scary. As a psychologist, there's one thing to obviously talk to your patients. There's another thing when it actually happens to you. And how do you deal with a situation like that? Well, Emily, I was just telling you that I have a different notepad today because my dog ate the one that I usually use, my puppy, which is hilarious. But that's what happens in life.
It does. It was very unexpected.
Thank you for coming to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for
I've
having
heard
me.
about your work for a long time now, so it's lovely to have you here. You're actually a clinical psychologist. I always like to start at the beginning in my podcast interviews. What drew you to want to study clinical psychology?
Well, if I go back into my childhood, I've always really been interested in why humans do what they do. So I just remember even as young as kind of 8, just being really fascinated about moral dilemmas, for example, and how people make decisions and why some people are happy and why some people aren't. And I think that's been a really kind of big interest of mine just intuitively. And so I really knew that I wanted to be a psychologist probably from year 12.
Wow.
And then I haven't really looked back since then. Yeah.
And I always wonder this about people within your space, psychologists, psychiatrists, even myself as a mindset coach. I definitely have experienced this. When you deal with topics like people come to you not because they're feeling on top of the world, otherwise they wouldn't need you. They come to you because they're not feeling on top of the world. And especially within your field, you get very heavy topics. How do you shield yourself from your client and something that is close to home? So if a client comes to you and they talk about something that's happening in their life that's actually happening in your life too, and it triggers something within you, how do you deal with that?
That's such a great question. And from a therapeutic stance, it's really kind of best practice to have a supervisor. So I have a supervisor who I will basically talk about anything that gets triggered for me in my sessions. So that's a really, really helpful kind of part of the process. That's right.
Every time we start recording.
I know, we've been here since 9 a.m. and we've had nothing.
Oh, no.
That's all right.
That's all right.
Do you want us to keep going or wait, Leash?
Okay.
Just to start from
Do
there.
you want to go from
Start
there?
from the answer.
Yeah. Look, I think it's a really, really important question because honestly, no human therapist or not is immune from being activated and triggered. I have a supervisor that I see, regularly who helps me really work with what's called countertransference. So this is this experience here that we get when we have someone sitting across from us who might be activating our own experiences, our own issues, our own challenges. And so
which happens with friends in daily
oh my
life
gosh.
as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is that there are two humans in the room. So just because you're a therapist or a psychologist, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be affected or influenced in some way. So yes, I see a supervisor. I also, in certain circumstances, will disclose, if it's appropriate, with a client, if that's an issue that I may have worked through or have some sense of understanding. But for the most part, it would be being able to pause long enough to notice whether it's helpful for me and for that client to be working together. So if it was a really big concern that I hadn't worked through, then I would have to give a lot of consideration as to whether it would be in their best interests to continue to see me, basically. Yeah.
Are there any times when you're with patients where the story has really affected you and, you know, you might even wake up that night thinking about it? It might be, you know, something that's very sad or just something that has really stayed with you longer than what it probably should because you are human?
Yeah, there have been many across the last 15 years, I would say. There have been many that, you know, sometimes no matter how much care you take of yourself, you can't not be impacted by sometimes like the despair or the depravity of someone's experience. And for me, often if for example, I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm thinking about a client in particular, that for me is usually a big signal of something I need to attend to. So whether that's I need extra support, whether I need to manage risk, for example. So usually the ones that I will worry about the most are the ones that might be actively suicidal. So they tend to be the ones that you carry with you in the back of your mind often. Once they leave the room, you don't know where they are or how they're going. And so that's sometimes probably the trickiest part of the job, is managing this concern and worry that you have for how people are when they're not face-to-face with you. Yeah.
It's such an important job that you do, and I think a lot of the time people forget that therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists are human. Have you ever had a patient that's taken their life?
I haven't. And I say this with such, gentleness, because in our training, we are really advised that it's very likely at some point in your career that you will be exposed to the loss of a client. And so there's part of me that kind of expects maybe at some point. There's a very, very big part that hopes that, in some ways we can do enough for that never to happen. But it is something that we hold an awareness of. And, at the bottom of everything, it's like how you value a human life. And sometimes, despite your best efforts and the efforts of everyone around a person, that suicide does occur, as we know. And that is a really hard thing to sit with and to hold. Yeah.
Wow. I wanted to talk to you about, you've got this beautiful book called Unstuck, and there are so many things in there that I want to speak to you about. But I wanted to start at the beginning, in the idea that people feel potentially that they're very, as you say, stuck within the book, but they come to you in these situations where they're in complete despair and most likely feel like they're one of the only people in the world to ever experience this, which makes you feel more isolated and lonely, and they can't get out of the feelings that have in their head a lot of the time, in a sense, put them in jail. Talk to us about when you see patients like that and the advice that you give them.
In those moments, I think it's so crucial for them to feel really seen and cared for in that distress. So we can't possibly move to strategies, to interventions, to behaviours until we can sit and be with each other face to face and to really validate the immense suffering that's here. And if we look at any of the research about change, as much as, like Instagram and TikTok will tell us otherwise, we know that the biggest agent of change therapeutically is what is happening between me and the client. So it's this therapeutic relationship that is actually functioning to facilitate change. So there is no silver bullet or no magic behavioural tool that we can implement, particularly in the face of someone's immense suffering. That first step, that first process is, how do you have someone hold that with you to not abandon you in that, to reflect back what you see and to really care for them in that moment?
What would you say to them to make sure that they're seen? Because I think a lot of the time what I understand from my research of human nature is we all just want to be seen and heard and know that we're important in some way. As a therapist, what do you say to clients to allow them to feel that?
I think it's, in some ways, it's complex and really nuanced to explain, like, these really often very micro actions or behaviours in a session. But, kind of, I guess, speaking very concretely, it might be often a paraphrasing. So what I'm hearing you tell me is X, Y, and Z, or it sounds like blah. Am I on the right track? So I'd always be, making an effort to validate that first. So to really say that sounds incredibly difficult, challenging, uncomfortable, kind of using it some sort of an emotional reflection, and then paraphrasing what I've heard, and then asking if that's true. Like, does that feel like I'm on the right track there? So we're really kind of wanting to kind of work together in some ways to work out, what is this current map and how can I accurately mirror that back to you?
There's a practice that you do within your practice, which is called ACT, Acceptance Commitment Therapy. Can you explain a bit about what that is and why that's different to cognitive therapy?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So acceptance and commitment therapy, really there's a long history to its evolution. It is often related to or similar to CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy, but it has a very different kind of lens to it. So even in the title, we can see that there are these two components. There's an acceptance and then there's a commitment part. So the acceptance component really looks at this idea of, instead of trying to get rid of pain or to make it go away, to challenge it, to make it look different, we're actually moving towards this idea of being open, curious, willing, and present to what is here. And in the face of that, committing to an action. So in CBT, which most obviously has immense applicability and evidence base also, but in CBT we might be looking at things like really challenging our core beliefs and developing a different set of beliefs in order to create a change. So for some people, CBT is a really good fit, and for other people, acceptance and commitment therapy might be something that's more worthwhile for them. There's a big values component in acceptance and commitment therapy, and it kind of functions in some ways as a bit of a foundation for us to understand where it is that we want to go.
It's interesting, in the personal development realm that I play in a lot, there's a lot of talk now about not rehashing the past too much. And the idea, if we're like always going back to our childhood and always going through what happened to us, it's not helping anything, right? And the idea that let's get on with the present and learn the tools to cope with the here and now and moving forward. And it's interesting, I've been thinking about it a lot and hearing different thought leaders and psychologists talk to this, because it's not what the old way of psychology used to teach us. And I wonder what your opinion on that is.
To be really honest, I think it requires both.
Yeah.
Because if we look at, in essence, what we're looking at in therapy is uncovering patterns and uncovering how it is that these patterns have been functioning for us in both a helpful and unhelpful way. And so I think for a lot of people, it can be really crucial to understand how it is that these patterns developed and why it is in particular that they had some sort of adaptive function in childhood, because that opens the door to a compassionate lens. So we can really understand that it was so understandable that this is how you've understood the world. That's really important, that we can hold a foundation here of compassion. And so now we can see that in our adult life, that some of these old schemas or old thought patterns, beliefs are getting activated. So for us to have an understanding that that's what our patterns are is, I think, really crucial. But it's from that point we look at, okay, so how am I going to do things differently now? How do I want to show up differently? How do I want to move forward with my life? And also, what do I want to stand for in the face of this history? So really for me, it is about, in some ways, healing a lot of those patterns in order to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the most common reason that someone comes to you?
I have a feeling that one of the biggest kind of core drivers that we have for change, most obviously, is that people are feeling dissatisfied and they're stuck. But if we dig underneath that, if we dig underneath why someone is feeling stuck, for me, it is often around love and belonging. So there's some sense of loss, some sense of dissatisfaction, some sense of disconnection. And I think if we start with this foundation here of our kind of fundamental needs to belong, our needs for love and connection, I think once we've got that, then we can look at maybe some of the other issues that might be showing up.
So when someone comes to you and they feel like that, what are some of the tools that you would give them?
Well, it will vary. And I think this is why, in some ways therapy, online, for example, is difficult because what I might suggest with one client could be vastly different to what I suggest and what we work with another. So I think that's important to note at the beginning. But yes, we start with this empathic relationship between myself and the client. And what I might be doing with a client is maybe even highlighting, challenging where some of these behaviors or these patterns are causing problems. And then we can look at, well, what would you be doing differently? I do tend to often like to uncover, like I've indicated before, their values. So values piece is always really fundamental, kind of really regardless of what you're presenting with, because your values are like heading west. It's a direction. They function as a compass for us, and they're never ending. So you can never reach west. It is just an ongoing direction that kind of helps us guide us in a lot of ways. So once we uncover our values, then we can look at, okay, well, what is actually getting in the way of you living by them? And that might be a whole host of things. It could be lots of, negative ruminations. It could be anxiety, depression. It could be sensations in the body. And so once we uncover where it is that we want to go, we then look at, well, what's getting in the way?
For someone that comes in and is ruminating, which is such a common thing, most people, I would say nearly everyone's experienced rumination, how do you advise them to get out of that loop?
I think one of the first things is to look at the function of it. So what is this function here of the mind getting so hooked into these fears, beliefs, whatever it might be? So we look at the function of it. If we were to use an acceptance and commitment therapy stance with rumination, part of that is this idea that we're attempting to step back from the thoughts and to be able to observe them rather than to be in them. So one of the phrases that we would use in ACT is, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that X, Y, and Z. So it might look like, let's just say you're really worried about something you said at a party. And your mind keeps going around in circles about, I shouldn't have said that. What's wrong with me? They're going to think I'm blah, blah, blah. And so in the practice of therapy, what we might do is I'm just going to pause there for a second. Notice where you feel this rumination in the body. So we might place a hand on the chest if it's kind of bringing some anxiety in the body. And then it might be, okay, just slow down for a second. And what would it be like to put in this phrase, I'm noticing, I'm worried about what other people think of me. So we slow it down, I'm noticing. And with that phrase, it's a tool of what's called cognitive diffusion. So it's separating myself from the thought. I am not my thought, and thoughts are not facts. And so with this little phrase, I'm noticing, I'm having the thought, it provides us with a space. And in that space, we then have this capacity to choose how we want to relate to what's happening. And so oftentimes for people, deep in rumination, this is kind of like a circuit breaker. It kind of takes us out a little bit. It gives us some breathing space. And ultimately what we're looking at is this idea that I can have some cognitive flexibility. So when I step back and I can see the thought for what it is, maybe I can see another perspective to it. Or maybe I can then make a choice that might be helpful, like, can I now ground myself with my senses? Can I go and move my body? Can I soothe the part of me that's really worried with some kind of gentle touch, maybe a shower, eating something? So we're really kind of growing a space in order to really tune into what we need rather than what the mind is kind of desperately seeking.
I love that's really great wisdom. I'd love also to talk about when people have irrational thoughts or what we call catastrophizing thoughts. Everyone's had them. A lot of the time, some people may catastrophize over situations that will never occur, and they get very worked up about it. So it's not even like something in this present moment has brought them there. It's just a completely catastrophized scenario that they've created that has then caused them to worry a lot. How do you deal with a situation like that?
There's a number of ways in which we'd want to approach that. And for someone that's really deeply hooked into rumination and catastrophic thinking, that can take a bit of time. But there's a number of things that we would do. And one of them is really actually having a look at what you would do if the catastrophic thing happened. So what we know is that we do have a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of the bad thing happening in combination with an underestimation of our ability to cope with what happens. And so as a kind of almost like a challenging exercise, we might go, okay, so let's just say that worst case scenario does happen. If it happens, how will you cope with it? So now we actually move into problem solving rather than keeping us stuck in that cycle of rumination. And so it moves us away from that space of uncertainty, the what if, and the anxiety that accompanies that, and then moves us into, okay, so if this really bad thing did happen, how would I be? Now, obviously there are circumstances where a catastrophic thing might be something deeply painful, like the loss of a family member, for example, particularly if we're really hooked into safety concerns there. So in those instances, we may not do that. We might come back to the safety of this present moment. So the mind is pulling you off into the future. And when it's pulled you off into the future, you're missing out here on what is here. And that, provided there is nothing attacking us right now, in this moment, we are safe. In this moment, I can see my child breathing. In this moment, we find the safety. So there are kind of a multiplicity of ways in which we could work with catastrophizing, but most often they do involve looking at the resources that we already have within us, looking at how we may have coped with things in the past, but then also really fundamentally coming back to the safety of this here and now. Yeah.
Within your book, there are so many beautiful sprinkles of Buddhism and mindfulness, which has been a big part of your life, a big part of my life, which I love that you had in there a lot of, I've had Jack Cornfield on this podcast. and you quote him within the book. He's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Why have those practices or those ways of thinking been important in your life?
They've been important because I've felt it.
Mm.
And I was introduced really to kind of mindfulness and meditation practices very early on in my training. And I have no doubt it has profoundly impacted how I practice as a psychologist, my capacity to be more present. So to be able to notice when the mind wanders off and bring it back. This is exactly the skill that we need when we're sitting with someone. I've just been so lucky to do some really interesting training. So I've done, 10-day silent retreats. We get exposed to this internal landscape and to really understand ourselves in a different way. But I think what I know to be so true is that the more present I am, the more rich my life feels. And in a world that feels at times really deeply overwhelming, I think we have to have that kind of well of, of beauty that's here that we can so readily miss out on otherwise. So yeah, it's been a really significant part, both personally and then also really professionally as well.
In 2021, you were diagnosed with breast cancer, which, it's just scary. The statistics show that 1 in 2 people these days will get some form of cancer. And as a psychologist, there's one thing to obviously talk to your patients about these sort of things. There's another thing when it actually happens to you and you are in the cold face of it. How did you navigate that time?
Gosh, I mean, it was really hard. And it was particularly hard, I will say, it was during COVID. And I live in Perth. My parents and my extended family live in Melbourne. And so they weren't able to come over. And at that part, like that's the thing, is like whenever you are confronted with your mortality, with loss, with grief, you want, and it highlights the things that are the most profoundly important to you, and that is them and obviously my husband and my kids. And
your kids would have been very young at the time.
They were really young, yeah. So my daughter was a year and a half maybe, and my son was almost 4.
Jeez.
Yeah. And it was just like, for anyone that goes through a kind of a life-altering diagnosis or anything like that, there's a part that feels incredibly vivid. So I just remember during those periods of time when I didn't know the extent of the diagnosis, I remember things like colour being so much more vibrant than I'd ever experienced it before. Like the sky looked like an unreal colour of blue. And it's like it turns all of your senses up to everything that you love and value in the world. And so, I was so fortunate, so fortunate. It was caught really early and the prognosis was excellent. I wasn't, after that uncertainty, I felt very confident with the treatment and where that would lead.
What treatment did you have to have?
So I had surgery and then I had a course of radiation.
Yeah.
So I was very lucky. I didn't have to undergo any chemotherapy, which was a blessing. But the moment where you step into, like it's almost like you step through the door of recognizing into this world now of recognizing that bad things can happen to you. And if, I was very fortunate that, I think I was 39 when I was diagnosed. And prior to then, I would say I was one of those very lucky people that hadn't encountered, a lot of grief or a lot of suffering in that sense. And we walk around with this kind of strange mystique around us, I think, for a long time until we encounter something like this. And then you walk through this door and now you know that actually there was a facade of certainty. There was a facade of safety. And now we know that life can change in a second. But there is a great gift in that. There is an immense gift in that. And I think, having kind of gone through that process, it just highlights what's most meaningful to you. And, okay, so now I know definitely that life will end at some point, and how am I going to show up to that now that I'm here?
I wonder what the cancer taught you now about living and what you changed within your life.
Mm-hmm. I just think at the end, and I don't mean for this to sound really silly, but I think it's just about loving people. I really do.
I do too.
Yeah. It's just about, like, when you leave the earth, that people have felt loved. And they felt loved by you, and that you've had the gift of being loved by them. Just don't really think anything else matters in the end, actually.
It's interesting when you're faced with those situations, or you're faced with other people that you love in those situations, and how, as you mentioned, that the idea of sweating the small stuff, you think, why did I even care about that?
Yeah.
Like, it does not matter. And I think hopefully if you come through the other end, what you take from it is the idea of not sweating the small stuff, and the fact that life does change within an instant in some circumstances, to just, as you mentioned, enjoy that every day. Enjoy the time with those people that you love, with your kids. That's all really there is, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, with our lives, we're so busy climbing for more, and the idea that, you know, how much further can we get in our careers, how much more money can we make, and all these things. But really, that can all be gone in a flash. And then what?
Yeah. And if you do get it, what's it worth if you're not here? You know, it's really interesting, because I think, you know, we actually can't live in the present all the time. So, you know, I'm really aware that it's okay if we do on occasion get hooked into, like, the annoyances of the traffic, or, you know, I don't know, lunch boxes or WhatsApp messages or whatever it might be. I think that is a normal part of, you know, being a human. We're going to get annoyed about stuff. But I think it needs to be held also with this return back to some kind of presence, and return back to, you know, again, this kind of sense of gratitude for being here. Because it's just not possible to fully live in gratitude all the time. And there's probably some dangers in doing or attempting to do that. But yes, sweating the small stuff, like, absolutely. Faced with grief, loss, diagnoses, that becomes one of the first things, I think, that you become really aware of. It's like, that stuff doesn't matter. It really doesn't.
It's so interesting, you know, and again, a lot of this has come out of the work that I've done, is that awakening begins when crisis occurs, and we don't want people to get to that state to be able to transform their lives. Like, the information you give, the information I give, is so people don't need to get to the states that both of us have been in to be able to get the best out of their life. And I think that's why, you know, the work you do is so great, because there is so much suffering in the world, but we don't need to suffer. You know, there's a beautiful quote I use a lot from Rumi, with, why do you keep yourself in jail when the door is open, right? And he talks to the mind with that. And I wonder for you, you know, out of all the different things you've seen, why do you think that humans suffer so much?
It's obviously an inherent part of being human. It's tricky to disentangle. I think we know, well, you know, if we were to take a Buddhist lens on this, we know that pain is inevitable, but suffering does not have to be. And I think in a lot of ways the work that I'm doing is around being able to acknowledge that pain will be here, that there will be many times then when we face really difficult and challenging experiences, but the more that we struggle against, avoid, become overwhelmed by the pain, the more likely it is that we will move into suffering. And suffering is the part that moves us away from living. So, I think we have to disentangle what is a normal expectation of a life well lived. And a life well lived will always involve pain. No one escapes that, but it doesn't have to be at the cost of vitality or well-being or connection. We can, if we're willing, work with the pain so that it doesn't cost us that kind of suffering, I think.
The Buddhists talk to attachment and how attachment causes suffering. And we think about that in our lives, the attachment we have to the people that we love, the attachment we might have to a job opportunity. There are plenty of clients that I see who've worked the same job for 30 years who suddenly get made redundant and then they feel that they're not worthy. How do you talk through people who are very attached to things and it's causing them suffering?
Yeah. There's an analogy, and you'll have to forgive me, I can't actually remember who first shared this, but there's an analogy about our identity and sense of self as being a little bit like a house. And if you imagine that there are like 10 rooms in the house, but we only live in one room of that house. And so let's just say it's the identity attached to a job, a career. And so that you live just exclusively in the front room of the house. That's everything that, it means everything to you, this front room. And you've not paid any attention to any of the other rooms, that you don't go in there, you don't look after it. They're completely empty. And so this room is vastly and deeply important to you. But the question is, what happens if that room burns down? So what happens if the room floods? If that room floods, we have nothing left. So what might happen is, if you retire, this sense of self, this identity that was so consumed by being that person, now leaves you open to a sense of immense loss, to emptiness, and really not knowing who you are. So in the work of therapy, we want to highlight when it is that we're getting really attached to a certain identity and the costs of holding on to that really tightly. And that is usually that it doesn't allow us to explore all the other parts of ourselves and the parts of our lives that might be really rich. So it might be, in the house analogy, that yes, you might spend a lot of time in that front room, but also we want to pop into the other rooms and spend some time there too, so that when this room does burn down or it floods or something bad happens to it, we can also then go into these other parts and say, these parts give me meaning as well.
I love that.
Yeah, I think it's just really useful to recognize when it is that an identity or a role or a career or a label is held on to for dear life in some ways.
I'd love to talk about, you speak about in your book, hedonic, if I'm pronouncing it right, hedonic adaptation.
Yeah.
So the idea of short-term happiness, I see people doing this. I know a lot of people who do this, where it's the new bag. And now I've got 5 Chanel bags, 6 Hermes ones, and I'm still not happy. I've put them on Instagram 20 times, whatever it is. And there's still suffering that occurs, because the idea is that you get the dopamine effect, I assume, very fast, and it brings you up. You've bought this beautiful bag or whatever it is, car, whatever, and then you get over it. Talk to us about why that short-term happiness and how to move away from that and what people should be doing instead.
I think, first of all, just being able to name and notice that this is a pattern that occurs, and to be really wary of it. So, yes, we know that we basically will adapt to the new thing. We habituate to the new thing. So at the start, that new thing will, and the anticipation of the new thing in particular, will feel very pleasurable. So let's just say you get a new car, and for the first few months you get a lot of thrills or pleasure from driving in this new car. But then after a period of time, we know that we adapt to the new piece, the new thing, and now it no longer brings with it the same kind of pleasure that it did at the start. And so now that it's not bringing the pleasure, we then seek the next thing. So we'll often look at it like, it's called the hedonic treadmill. So it's just like a constant cycling through the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. with the often misguided view that if I get that thing, I will then be happy, and that's all I need to do to get there. So being able to highlight that as a first step, that, oh, I'm caught up in this. This makes sense. That's, I think, a helpful thing. We can bring, if there's something that you really love and that you've desired it for a long time, obviously we could bring some mindful awareness to this thing so that we can look at it with a beginner's mind every time if we really wanted to stay with that object, for example. So every time you open the car door, notice what it feels like. Every time you put your hands on the steering wheel, every time you sit down, maybe notice the smell of the car, for example. So we're actually kind of trying to work with a sense of presence and gratitude so we don't habituate as readily. But, that aside, what we want to have a look at is how we're seeking happiness. And are these things actually on track to what will genuinely provide lasting transformative change and happiness? And usually we know that they don't.
In your experience, where do you find that lasting happiness? Where do you find that lasting happiness comes from?
Well, it's interesting, and I will have to kind of change what I've just said, but I think when we think about happiness, we actually know that usually being happy is a mood state. So we know that happiness, like any emotion, comes and goes. And so in some ways what we want to be looking at, well, what is going to create a rich and meaningful life? And so we can kind of gather from that what makes life worth living is where there is meaning. So what is it that gives you meaning and purpose? What is it that gets you up in the morning? Like, why are we actually here? And most often we know it's not for those objects. And that's where a values piece would come in. So values are often a really good guide for connecting to meaning and purpose. So when we think about what is going to create lasting change or lasting well-being, then meaning, purpose, and vitality are big pieces of that.
How do people find purpose? Because I know a lot of the time they want to and they find it hard. They're not sure what it is they want to do, and they think I need it. Everyone talks about finding your purpose, but they're stuck.
Yeah, I think it's really fraught because there is so much information out there about almost like the pressing need to find your purpose, and also that it should look like a career. And I think that in a lot of ways we want to open up to the fact that it doesn't have to be in the laneway of your career choice. Purpose can come from being a parent. It can come from being a carer of your parents. It can come from tending to the garden. So I think we want to broaden our understanding as to what gives us purpose. So once we do that, like my invitation would always be, actually, let's get back to what you're interested in. So what are your genuine interests? And I think along the way of life, particularly around midlife, we have disconnected or lost contact with the parts of ourselves that we once used to love. And so we might not really even be in contact with the things that are even interesting to us. We're just caught up in the automatic pilot of getting through the day and then getting to sit down at the end and scroll on the phone. So my invitation would always be, let's actually spend quite a bit of time uncovering what your interests are. It might involve even kind of going back to childhood and thinking about, like, if I could see you playing as a kid, what would I have seen you doing? And so sometimes that will uncover maybe creativity, it might be movement, it might be investigating. So when we uncover that, we're like, okay, let's now go out and try a whole host of things. So I think that's something that we aren't very good at as adults, so trying new hobbies, for example, and being a beginner again. But I think it's a really great platform, like, try stuff.
Yeah. And I always think about, like, what would you really want to do if money wasn't an issue?
Yes. Yeah.
And that always gets people to really think, well, I actually really like this, but I don't think it will make money. But then what else within that is something that you could do? It's so important, the different techniques and things that you've given everyone to think about. They say that comparison is the thief of joy. I've experienced it in my own life. I think we all have. Social media can be a place where that absolutely creeps in, where you don't even realize that you've been scrolling on some sort of social media for half an hour, seeing people, what you think are living their best lives, achieving maybe things you haven't. For some people, it might be that these people just have items that they want to have, and that really makes them feel very sad. How do we get out of the cycle of comparison?
It's so compelling. Like the cycle of comparison is so compelling. I mean, the first thing obviously is that we need to recognize when we're doing it. We need to be able to pause or find some kind of practice that alerts you to the fact that I've got caught up in this moment here of comparison. So envy tends to show up a lot in comparing mode. And envy really is this desire to have something that I don't have currently. And then when there's a big gap between what someone else has and what I don't have, then we're more likely to get really caught up in that rumination cycle, for example. So there are a number of different ways in which we could approach that comparing mode. One of them often is actually coming back to comparing ourselves with ourselves. So sometimes that can be a way of moving us away from this outward comparison. And so I would often look at this in terms of things like career progression, or even kind of growth in general. So instead of looking outwards, if I was to ask you 5 years ago, what was Emily doing 5 years ago? And how has she changed across the last 5 years? What has she learnt? What has she gone through? What skills has she developed? And for the most part, there are very few people that I've met that can say that they're in a worse spot than they were 5 years ago in terms of certain skill growth, for example. So we want to come back just to, okay, so a year ago, how was I doing? 5 years ago, how was I doing? And then that can give you almost like a greater contact with some confidence that I am moving forward. So often the comparing mode comes with a sense of feeling like I've been left behind. We want to have a look at, well, how have I left behind Emily from 5 years ago? And often that can allow people a bit of a different perspective there, I think.
Absolutely. And as you kind of pointed to, sometimes it's not about the obvious, like, I've achieved this and I've done this. It's the fact that, I'm not ruminating as much as what I used to. I learned from that experience and I would never do that again. I'm not going to surround myself with those sort of people anymore. And that is growth.
Yes.
And that is movement.
Yes.
In the book, you talk about a situation that you had in regards to your when you obviously had cancer and now cancer-free, but a time where you were going for a mammogram. And they asked you to stay around.
Yeah.
So, anyone in that situation would think, oh, my God, they've seen something again, right? Which you thought as well, because that's not the usual situation where they take it and you move on. And obviously then fear started kicking in. I want you to talk through that to us, because I know there'd be so many people who have maybe been in that situation or may go through that situation, and how you work through the different voices in your head and the fear that came to you then.
So this is a very compassionate based approach to how I live, but also to how I practice. And part of that is recognizing the suffering in this moment. And so, if I go back to that time, I remember it very vividly. I'd just been directed to go and wait in this room. And my first thought was like, it's back. And for me, what I did in that moment was I placed my hand on my heart and I said, Emily, I'm here for you. And so it's this recognition of the fact that there was a younger part of me that was very, very scared. And that vulnerable child needed to be cared for in that moment. there was nothing I could do to prevent what was about to happen, good or bad. So all I could do was care for that little girl who was petrified. And so the hand on my heart is an action of nurture and support. And again, it's kind of offering a kindness, a compassion for this moment. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't problem solve my way out of it. Getting caught up in the rumination was going to make me feel more and more anxious. And so it was really about being able to name that you're really worried and I'm here for you right now. And I think that approach is often one of the only ones we have in the times when we're confronted with something really painful. It's not going to take away the pain. It's not going to push it away or get rid of it, but it's just about acknowledging that you're not alone in this, even with yourself in some ways.
It's interesting when you talk to putting the hand on your heart, because I've found I do that in meditation, a guided meditation that I've done for many years. When I do it, it'll talk to putting at the end, putting your hand on your heart and things that you're saying. And I feel that touch is so powerful. As soon as I do that, it kind of changes my state a lot. Why is that?
I can't speak to the exact science. I am aware that Kristen Neff, who has developed mindfulness-based self-compassion programs and done a lot of incredible work in the self-compassion world, she talks about the fact that when we place our hand on our heart, it is really kind of activating this mammalian system, which is, again, releasing oxytocin, which is sort of the feel-good hormone. It's the hormone of love and connection. And so when we really tune into the sensations of the hand on the heart, and we can, for example, breathe with that sensation, really feel the warmth of the skin, it's actually really shifting us often from that fight or flight state, which is highly mobilized and aroused, into a state more of this kind of relaxation response. It's almost really akin to a moment of being hugged by someone. So the hand on the heart for me is really kind of like an act of giving myself a hug in the absence of there being anyone else around to do that for me.
Do you still meditate?
I do, yeah.
And do you do that most mornings or days?
Well, it varies, but I do tend to do it. Historically, I've had this practice so I've got 2 young kids, and as you all know, like the bedtime can be lengthy. But once they go to bed and then before, like, I move into time, to time with my husband, that I will often do a meditation practice in that kind of transition period. And that will vary in terms of what I will do. Sometimes I will do just a silent meditation with bells. Sometimes I'll do more of a guided one. It kind of really depends upon what I feel like I'm in need of in that moment. I think particularly if I've had a really busy, frantic day, or there's been a lot of chaos in the home period, then actually just being in silence feels really helpful. If I've had a really overwhelmingly hard day at work with lots of big distressing pieces of information, that I might do something like a loving kindness practice. It really kind of depends what the need is in some ways. But I also do it during the day at work as well. So I might do it on my lunch break. I will do it most often with my clients. I will guide them. So that's probably a different realm. But it certainly is, and I intend for it to be just a part of daily living, really.
I mean, for me, meditation is transformational. It's the thing I think that changed me the most out of any of the practices that I've done. And like you, I will change the meditation depending on what's going on in my life or how I'm feeling. If I really want to get into my heart, I try and do that sort of meditation most mornings. If I have time to do one in the afternoon, it will be different depending on how I'm feeling and But I do like to start off with one in the morning because I know what my life's like, and if I don't get it in then I'll think I'll get it in the afternoon and I don't. But it is, doing it at work or being able to doing it during a break is a beautiful reset as well, especially if things get overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't advertise mindfulness enough. I think it's got a bad rap, I'll be honest. I think we've overused the term, and I think it's also, its meaning has become somewhat lost. It's not about clearing the mind. It's not about relaxation. Really, it's about being able to tune in and to bring awareness, because without this awareness, we will act on autopilot. We will be more reactive, more driven by our emotions. And so the practice of mindfulness is about being able to tune in to what you're holding, what the mood state is, what your needs are. It's really kind of just a really great source of knowledge at the end.
And, with meditation, I always say this, but you end up actually really enjoying it. Like, I love going into those states now because firstly, it's just time to relax, quieten the mind, feel love in the heart, doesn't matter what's happened. To be able to get into that state every day, you can do it for 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long period of time. It just makes me feel like so much calmer and content. It's a beautiful place to be.
It is. And I think it's really important to mention that it doesn't have to be, 30 minutes, 40 minutes of you sitting in silence. I genuinely think even if you can do 1 minute, even just 1 minute of tuning into your breath, for example, that is better than 20 minutes once a week.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, Emily, what is some of the best advice that you have ever been given?
Oh, wow. I was just thinking about what my grandpa used to say.
Yeah.
This is so unrelated really to anything. But he always used to say that you make more friends coming second. And I like, we used to joke about it in our family that you make more friends coming second. But I think there's some underlying message in there about the fact that in the end, winning is not actually the most important piece. Being the most successful is not the most important. But friendship and connection is probably really the heart of the matter, I think.
It's so funny you say that. I recently had heard something that was talking to the same thing. It was only last week, that if you win every fight, you will only make an enemy of that person.
Yeah.
And I had never thought about that before. Basically, like, you don't always need to win the fight.
Yeah.
You'd probably be better off not winning it, or the argument.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said. I mean, obviously, I have no idea where my grandpa got that saying from. It's quite possibly not based in anything.
Yeah.
But I like the sentiment in there that we don't always have to be focused on the best, the most, the enoughness piece. Like, what happens if you just look around you a little bit more, I think.
What's something that you wish for yourself?
I wish for myself to be as present as possible to the joys of being here, I think.
And our final question, what is a life of greatness to you?
Oh, I just got a lot of warmth in my heart then. A life of greatness is walking away once again knowing that I've made some kind of contribution, but most importantly, that my children know that they were so loved. Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much for such a beautiful conversation today.
Thank you.
It was lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.